Yeah, so Broadcom Software, we're the layer 7 people, API management, and I'm going to talk to you about GraphQL and our experience with it. Yesterday we had an API Academy workshop, and so just a quick recap because this presentation is a bit of an extension to that, where we talked about how GraphQL is showing up increasingly at our customers' architectures, and because we're helping our customers secure and enable their APIs, there's big implications for us. Yeah, so we hear people say things like, we're standardizing on GraphQL. We feel that this feels like there's no turning back, and API infrastructure definitely needs to adapt. So yesterday we talked about what are the implications of GraphQL for things like authentication, authorization. We talked about best practices around GraphQL and things like what happens to rate limiting, or how should you do query cost analysis, and what are the different ways you should be doing query cost analysis, and how does GraphQL change the way that you're looking at OAuth API Sec Top 10. So that was fun, but today we're turning this around and we're sharing with you our experience with adopting GraphQL for our own purposes, right? This is not about our customers' GraphQL API. This is about us going through this process of choosing GraphQL for a really critical API that we're using for our own product. So how we chose that, and if hopefully somebody in the room is maybe wondering whether or not they should choose GraphQL for a project, hopefully the lessons learned that we learned through this process can be helpful for somebody else. So the use case for which we ended up with a GraphQL API is configuration management, which is definitely not an obvious use case for a GraphQL API, right? But so layer 7's been around for 20 years, just to give you a little bit of context, because that's relevant here. But over these years, we've had some customers along the way that have been with us for a long time, and they gradually created this really, really big set of really complicated configurations, right? So thousands of policies and other entities that relate to each other. Entities like services that are exposed by our API gateway, policies that are applicable to these APIs, connectors where we do the integration, and different data sources that during these policies you're hooking up to, and secrets that are required to connect to these external things, and certificates that you trust, and connect counters for rate limiting and stuff like that. So all these things are defined as entities in the configuration of our gateway, and that configuration needs to be nurtured. For us, it's extremely important. We, of course, want to remain sticky for another 20 years at our customers, so we need to help them manage this configuration. So they need to analyze the configuration, maybe duplicate part of it, or upgrade the configuration, map some environmental values to it. And so we've had an existing API for many, many years. At the time, it was built on REST, and it's using XML, and it's been great, right? It's been helping us achieve this up to now, but it is hard to use, and configuration management is something that is becoming more and more important for our customers, and this legacy API is limiting our ability to deliver next generation configuration management capabilities that we want to do. Like, we want to make it really easy for customers to use configuration as code, for example, for our gateway, and because it's 20 years old, well, it's evolved, of course, along the way, but it wasn't designed for this from the start, so we needed to start something fresh. So introducing Graphman. And again, like, I'm not here to sell you Graphman, but hopefully those lessons learned are helpful for somebody. So it's our next generation configuration management API. It's GraphQL based. That's why we're talking about GraphQL. And it's really wired into the core of the layer 7 gateway, the same way that you might do an electric car retrofit in this beautiful model there. So it complements and replaces the existing tooling. We have a simplified representation of the configuration. It's much faster so far. We calculate checksum on entities to make it easier to compare deltas between different gateways, for example. And a lot of it is about dependency management, right? Imagine thousands of little entities that relate to each other in lots of different ways. That GraphQL API is there to help us with that. And the lessons learned that I'm going to share with you are twofold. First is, what about this developer experience complexity that's being introduced as part of choosing GraphQL as opposed to a REST API? And the second one is about evidence of the trade-off that you get from this complexity in the form of benefits on innovation that are provided by GraphQL as a choice. So we're observing that, and we want to share this with you. So developer experience friction. The thing is that GraphQL is just not the right abstraction for most users, right? If I wake up in the morning and I'm responsible for managing the configuration of Gateway, on my to-do list this morning, I want to update the configuration maybe. But what's not on my to-do list is learn GraphQL. Why would I need to do that, right? So front-end developers do love GraphQL for their own reasons, but if you're just trying to accomplish a task, example, copy my configuration to another gateway, it's not okay for GraphQL to become a prereq to accomplishing this task. And for the average configuration management user that we're targeting, GraphQL really feels unnecessarily complex, and that has been a challenge from the beginning, right? We're definitely questioning our choice of GraphQL for this thing, and so we're always like thinking about this. So I'll give you a couple examples of that developer experience complexity that's introduced by choosing GraphQL. So here's the first one. The simplest thing for configuration management is just to pull the entire configuration of the gateway. If I do this with REST, maybe it looks like this, right? HTTP get / everything. Super easy for developer, right? If I'm a GraphQL, if in this GraphQL API, to pull everything, I need to literally have all the entities defined, all of the properties of these entities. So at this point, because we're still productizing this API and it's still maturing, it's something that's in progress. But this query right now is 250 lines long. So obviously, this feels really, really unnecessarily complex. I'm just trying to pull the entire config. Here's another example where with GraphQL, we are finding that when you're chaining a query and a mutation, so I'm getting configuration from somewhere and I want to apply it somewhere else. So you do a query to pull the configuration and a mutation to apply it. So I'd like to be able to take the output of the query and take that, and that becomes the input to my mutation. But although GraphQL allows the client to control the format in which the data comes back and which properties are of interest to you, which entities are of interest to you, it doesn't let you completely change the output format. So there are things in the input of the mutation that are not there for in the output of the query. So for example, there's this leading data there. I don't want this in the input of my mutation. And when we're pulling dependencies, you can see there at the bottom, I've got an XML policy associated to what is this, a web service API. And these other policy fragments, I need to flatten this out in the way that you see that on the right. So I need to move things around and do stuff like that. So that feels like an added complexity that I didn't have to deal with before in that other API that was REST-based. And there's a few things like that where, I'm just listing two things here to illustrate this point. But it does feel to some people that, holy cow, this is way too complicated. And we were supposed to make this easier, right? What's going on here? Why are we adding developer experience complexity? And the answer that we're finding for this is that it's not about, if GraphQL is not the right layer of abstraction, then that regular user shouldn't be using that API. You should use the tooling. So introspection and code completion and stuff that you get out of GraphQL does help address that developer complexity to a certain extent, right? It really, really helps. But if you've got an API like Graphmen that's really, really complicated, I mean, it's very, there's a lot of different entities and a lot of different properties. It's definitely not enough. So what do? We give the user Postman collections, right? Where we have lots and lots of samples, like samples per queries, for each mutation. We have per request documentation. For the massaging of the data that I was talking about, where we need to change the format that comes out of the GraphQL queries into a format that the GraphQL mutation requires. We're just using JavaScript and pre-request and test inside Postman, which allows to make those changes. So that works well, right? It's completely transparent to the user when they're using our Postman collection. We also give you CLI wrappers, because Postman is a good way to understand the API, but when you're actually accomplishing your task in CI/CD and stuff like that, you can't use Postman necessarily. So command line interface wrappers, there's a nice README, there's curl wrappers inside Bash scripts, there's JSON transformation that's provided as examples in JavaScript files and you've got these pre-baked samples in a nice little public GitHub repo that you can pull. So that's kind of how we manage this DX complexity. If I give you Graphmen to move your config from one layer 7 gateway to another, you're not going to actually see any GraphQL if you're a regular user. And I would argue that it's actually really, really common for an API provider to give the client-side developers things like SDKs or code snippets. You know, if you're using gRPC, a .proto file, or code generation. So it's already, I would argue, an accepted pattern to not always work directly with the API for your common task, and you're switching down to the API layer to do more powerful stuff. So we feel that GraphQL helps us by helping the power user innovate more. And we do this by keeping that tooling layer open, right? So the API is our API, but the tooling that we give the users is completely open. So the GraphQL layer itself targets the power user. And I'll show you examples of why we actually need this ability to enable the power user. And then you can reap benefits of this added flexibility provided by GraphQL. So the power user can create new specific queries and mutations that work together to address their own specific repeatable tasks that are very much domain specific. And the output of the work of that power user at the GraphQL layer is stuff that can be integrated into the tooling that targets the actual user. So the tooling layer itself targets the actual user, ops, whatever the next layer up is, the CI/CD pipeline or whatever. And so that actual user uses the pre-canned samples that come out of the box, right? If you're doing something that we anticipated would be a commonly required task, then we, of course, will have an out-of-box sample from that. But our customers' partners, or maybe they have an internal champion that dives deeper into this GraphQL API, they can augment the tooling in a way that helps specific use cases for that customer. So the second lesson learned is that true, right? Is there evidence of power user innovation that's made possible thanks to this GraphQL layer in a way that was not possible in the past in the older API, that REST XML API. So I'm going to give you an example where the power user introduces new capability in that GraphQL client layer, and that gets added to that tooling layer where the regular user can leverage that. So the first example of such evidence of innovation is something that a customer asked us, hey, you guys are building this new API. I have this thing where I want to do a reverse dependency analysis for certain entities because I want to know if, for example, this client certificate that I trust is actually referred by another policy or something else, or maybe I've got a shared secret or a connection endpoint or a policy, and maybe that was created 10 years ago. I'm not sure if we're still using that. So we have in GraphQL, in our GraphMan API, we have a pre-existing baked-in capability which calculates for dependencies that are bundled with policies that use them. But we don't have this reverse dependency. So my first thought when a customer asked me for this thing is like, oh yeah, we're totally going to go into our GraphQL API. We're going to create this new reverse dependency property, and we're going to put that on all of our entities that are defined in the schema, and we'll add code to calculate that, right? But then I thought about this. Maybe you don't need that. And sure enough, like we experimented a little bit, and without touching the server-side API, we came up with some custom queries and then that's where we're using the power of GraphQL, where you're pulling just exactly the right amount of data, the specific data that you need, and then you easily traverse and reverse the dependency to get the reverse dependency analysis. So using the same pattern of applying JavaScript to the GraphQL query response, we're able to just go through exactly the information that we need and just reverse it. And then we can update the tooling, and we actually added that as an out-of-box sample in the tooling layer of the API. So we didn't actually have to make any changes to the API, and to me that's a really powerful thing. So here's what it looks like. I'm in my Postman collection here. I created this, what I call this 4 dependency summary, right? Where I go through the dependencies. I'm pulling the specific properties for these different entities that I need. I get a response that has, so for example here, I can see that there's a JDBC connection. That's a dependency of this ABC policy. I have something called an ncast config that might not make sense to you if you're not a layer 7 user, but those two things are dependencies of this policy, this other policy called policy with ncast. So I can go in Postman here, and I'm just going to capture what this query looks like, and I paste that in that's my tooling, right? So the user can download this tooling. Now I can actually invoke that. So let's do this reverse dependency, which is basically calling this new query and does that reverse thing. And now I get this reverse dependency report that comes back. So I can see that this, well, if we just pass the JDBC connection here, there it is. So MyDB. Now we can see that MyDB has these reverse dependencies on these policy fragments, API services, and the same thing for all the entities in there. So there's this cluster property and all these different things. Okay, enough of this. You get the point. So the second example, and this is where we're going to get into this monolithectomy concept, is the idea of bundling 10 minutes, all right, a subset of your configuration, right? So entities relate to each other via lots of different mechanisms, right? So 2 different JDBC connections relate to each other because they're the same type. That JDBC connection was a dependency of a policy. So policies have dependencies. Customers organize these different configurations in a folder structure, and that's meaningful to our customers in their own domain-specific ways. So it's very practical to be able to bundle configurations based on the folder path property of these entities. And customers also have this thing where they have different layers of configuration, if you want, right? There's stuff that changes once every 6 months, and then there's stuff that changes whenever you add a new service or a new API, or maybe a new API key is created because a new app was created. So these things are more dynamic, right? So you've got framework versus services. Each of these types of configurations have different life cycles, so you need to, bundle these things together. You need to bundle per task, right? So I need to package a specific set of configuration because I'm updating a service, or I'm updating my framework. I need to maybe duplicate an API because I want to create an API that's almost the same but a little bit different. Or I want to do what I call a monolithectomy. And the point is that for any target configuration bundle that you require, there's a corresponding GraphQL query, right? Because there's almost an infinite different possibilities of a GraphQL query. So this is becoming very, very handy. So what I mean by this monolithectomy, and remember what I was saying earlier, we've got customers that have been with us for 20 years that basically build these monoliths of configuration over time, and they're at the point now when they're ready to start decoupling some of these things, right? They want to decode, detangle, and decompose their monolith and separate things based on concerns, because the pattern, the legacy pattern of having a big gateway that's responsible for all your APIs is just not scaling anymore. Customers want to go beyond that, which is great for us. So GraphQL client-side innovation comes to the rescue, right? So each of these puzzles is unique when you go into the wild. We have hundreds of customers, and they're all using the gateway in a very different way. Monolithectomies are a really complex procedure. You're encountering new species in the wild, and we cannot provide in the tooling that we give customers a sample that's going to be covering any possible way of organizing a configuration. And the client-side innovation that's provided by this GraphQL layer makes that possible because you have the power user that can come in, understand this new creature that they're running into for the first time, and you can have this expert tailor a query that's reusable for that particular creature, right? And you can reuse that for these different procedures on the same monolith if you want. So this is my last slide. In conclusion, I would like to say that, I hear a lot of detractors of GraphQL, and I kind of felt the duty calling to stand up for GraphQL a little bit. In my opinion, GraphQL is the chosen one. People ask me, when should you use GraphQL versus REST? Well, this is not so much a decision tree, but if it's about data, if your API is about data, probably GraphQL should be what you should be using, right? But in this case, we have a more task-oriented API, and it's really not obvious that you should choose GraphQL for that. But in fact, for us, it is extremely powerful application of GraphQL. So even for a task-oriented API, I would argue that maybe GraphQL is a really good choice. I would argue that complexity is a false concern when the alternative that you're considering still have an abstraction layer on top of your API, whether it's an SDK, a collection, or a snippet, or a proto file on top of the API. If that's the case, then it doesn't matter that your API is more complex. And the added sophistication allows for more client-side innovation. And in my opinion, that's great. And it should lead to a more stable API because you can delegate some of your innovation to the client. So for me as an API provider, I love that I'm empowering the client side because maybe, like for example, in that example where I wanted to do this reverse dependency, I didn't actually have to change the API. The client was able to do that. And the last point here, which is more a conclusion of yesterday's presentation, but I just put it out there regardless, API infrastructure definitely needs more GraphQL context to adapt to these new APIs. There are definitely some challenges introduced by that. That's it.
Thanks a lot, Francois. Is there any question from the room? Okay.
Uh-oh, we've got the GraphQL experts here asking GraphQL question. Go ahead.
What is your, how looks like your main communication with your clients? is through Postman. Postman is like your main tool to talk to them. This is the main developer portal, or are you having more docs or things like that?
Yeah, I'm actually going to show you what it looks like today. I mean, it's still in progress, but when you're downloading that tooling, you're getting this thing, right? And it comes with samples and the schemas in there. But in here, you actually have the Postman collection. So we put the Postman collection in the client tooling. So if you want to use CLI, use CLI. If you're more comfortable with Postman, you just take that JSON collection, you import it in there. Is your question like, what are clients gravitating to more, or?
Both, I guess. Also,
Yeah. So I think I would. Yeah. So it's still in progress, and we have a few early adopters right now. But Postman, we anticipate, is going to be the starting point for anybody, because it's a good way to understand how the API works, because you have a visual representation of all of these samples.
Thanks a lot. Any other question? Another one.
Yes, keep them coming.
When you said SDKs, if you do provide SDKs, how do you do it? What tools do you use?
We're not providing an SDK in this case, but I'm using SDK because it is a popular thing with other APIs. Yeah. So SDK to me is tooling, right? So if that's an accepted pattern, then this should be an accepted pattern.
Cool. Any other question?
Ronnie.
You've certainly showed the power of data access, right, as the use case. So did you ever consider, if the data set's not too big, why not just synchronize the data so your clients can do whatever the heck they want with the data locally, and then that kind of goes back and forth? Did you consider that?
Well, the thing is that people need to be able to, people want to do configuration as code, right? And when you're decomposing your monolith, synchronizing your data is not sufficient. You need to be able to get to the right data. And GraphQL is what lets you find the right subset for the right task. So synchronization by itself doesn't address that, but that's definitely part of the overall solution. You're right.
Cool. Any other one?
Yes.
Are you tracking, are you using queries in GraphQL to track actually what people are querying, and it gives you kind of more, a better image of what people are actually asking for?
We are not doing that right now, but you've got me thinking, yeah. Yeah, and the other thing that we're not getting into right now is query cost analysis. We're not sure how relevant this is going to be with us, but I'm fascinated by that concept, and yeah, I think that we might need to start looking into that as a next step.